Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Teaching Electronic Music, Cultural, Creative, and Analytical Perspectives, a conversation between Kathleen Galloway, Francesco Giomi, Lee Landy, and Blake Stevens. I am Giacomo Albert, and I will be today's moderator. This event is organized by RiSME-Digitali, which is the research group of the Italian Musicological Society, so Sidm, dedicated to the study of the history of electroacoustic music, digital music, and sound-based art that I myself coordinate together with Laura Zacca. This event is a part of RiSME-Webinar, which is a series of events coordinated by Valentina Bertolani, who is also here, webinars that discuss recent and groundbreaking books and their topics on electroacoustic music. Today's book is Teaching Electronic Music, Cultural, Creative, and Analytical Perspectives, a great book edited by Blake Stevens and published recently by Routledge. A great collection of essays that reflect upon electronic music teaching and pedagogy from many different perspectives, opening a lot of important questions that we would like today to discuss together. On our on the webpage of RiSME-Digitali, you can find the video recordings of the previous RiSME webinars dedicated to Reminded by the Instruments, David Tudor's music written by Yunakai, to the Sound Aesthetic in Experimental Music Practices written by Riccardo Wanchi, and to Sex Sounds written by Daniel Schromitz-Sofer. Moreover, you can also find the video recording of a 2-day international conference that we organized last December together with Fondazione Cini in Venezia about computer-aided composition. Now, the structure of this event. Today, we invited 4 great scholars to speak about Blake Stevens' book, Blake Stevens himself, Lee Landy, and Kathleen Galloway, who each of whom contributed with a chapter in the book, and Francesco Giomi, who is the most important expert in Italy about this topic and also member of RiSME. Now, a few words about the structure of this webinar. We will begin with 4 presentations of about 15 minutes each from each one of our panelists. The first one will be Blake Stevens's, then we will have Lee Landy, then Kate Galloway, and finally Francesco Giomi. Afterwards, a 1-hour discussion about the previous speeches and the topic will follow, and all the audience is warmly invited to participate. Now, just a very brief presentation of the 4 speakers. Blake Stevens is an associate professor of music history in the School of Arts at Peking University. He has published research on topics ranging from French Baroque opera and 18th century criticism and aesthetics to the historiography of electroacoustic music in journals such as the Journal of Musicology, 18th century music, Music and Letters, and many other publications. His current research project examines theories of agency in electroacoustic music from the 1950s to the present. He received a PhD in music history from Stanford University with a dissertation on the tradition of the monologue in French opera and tragedy in the Ancien Régime. After him, we will have the presentation of Lee Landy, who is a very, very well-known composer and musicologist. He holds a research chair at the De Montfort University, where he directs the Music, Technology, and Innovation Research Center and is affiliated at the Institute of Creative Technologies. Landy's musicological publications focus on studies of electronic music, including contemporary music in a cross-arts context and the contemporary time-based arts. He is chief editor of the International Journal of Music Technology, Organized Sounds, published by Cambridge University Press, and he is author of over 100 articles and 8 books on electroacoustic music and sound-based art. He directs the EARS, or Electroacoustic Research Site project, and is a founding member of the EMS, or Electroacoustic Music Studies Network, which is well known. After Lee, we will have Kate Galloway, who is an assistant professor in ethnomusicology, sound studies, and games at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Her research and teaching interests include experimental music and sound art, indigenous modernities in the performing arts, posthumanism and animal studies, music and digital media, game studies, science and technology studies, social justice and sonic culture, sound and sensory studies, critical popular music studies, and digital humanities. Her monograph Remix, Reuse, Recycle, Music, Media Technologies and Remediating the Environment is under contract with Oxford University Press, and examines how and why contemporary artists remix and recycle sounds, music, and texts encoded with environmental knowledge. She also published several articles and book chapters in journals and books as Ethnomusicology, Music Culture, Steel Studies, Sound Studies, the Oxford Handbook of Hip Hop Music, the Oxford Handbook of Music and Advertising, Playing for Keeps, etc., etc. The last speaker will be Francesco Giomi, who is an Italian electronic music composer and an important teacher of electronic music. He devoted his activity primarily to acousmatic art and live electronics, but in recent years he has been looking at a close relationship with electroacoustic improvisation. He is professor of electronic music at the Conservatory of Bologna and director of Tempo Reale, the most important music research, which is the most important music research center in Italy. Which has been founded by Luciano Berio in Florence. In 2008, Francesco started the Tempo Reale Festival dedicated to research music, and he worked closely with Luciano Berio in the past times and later collaborated with first-rate artists such as Henri Pousseur, David Moss, Hurricane, Virgilio Sieni, and many, many others. As a cultural worker, he has been
Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Valentina Bertolani, and Giacomo mentioned that we organized together these meetings with also Laura Zappa, and I think he's having some issues with his connection. So I'm sorry, and thank you for your patience. These things happen. So I guess if you want, we can go on with the conversation. Oh, Giacomo, hi.
Hi. Sorry, I don't know what it happened and when and why. Never mind. I don't know where I was when it did happen, so I don't know where I can start. Anyway, as I mentioned before, I hope the structure of this webinar is that we will have 4 presentations by Blake Stevens, Lee Landy, Kate Galloway, and Francesco Giomi, and later a Q&A, a collective Q&A discussion about the topics discussed by the 4 panelists. So probably I not mention something because I don't know when my internet connection went down. I don't have any idea why. I'm very sorry about this. But I just let Blake introduce his speech. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Giacomo, for organizing this colloquium. Can you hear me? Can I check to make sure you can hear? Thank you. Okay.
Yes.
And then I'm also going to share my screen so that I can show some slides. And I also, of course, want to thank Kate and Francesco and Lee for participating today. It's a pleasure and honor to be able to talk about this topic. And I look forward to a lively discussion. So to begin with, I thought it would be useful to describe some of the background of the volume. And then I want to pick up a historiographical challenge that I discussed in the book's introduction and develop it a bit further. First, I think it's critical to define the context of pedagogical reflection. The book appeared in the series Modern Musicology in the College Classroom. The type of classroom that initially inspired the book was the undergraduate music history survey. I hope that the book's usefulness transcends this inspiration, although it seems to me that there will inevitably be some fuzziness, even tension, between the streamlined narrative of a survey and the type of detail necessary to understand specific forms of electronic music. To suggest a broader framework, I situated the chapters within a constellation of 4 themes: instruments, agency, collaboration, and communication. With the first 2 categories, I wanted to suggest networks of agency among instruments, tools, materials, artists, and other mediators. With the second pair, collaboration and communication, I pointed to the circulation of electronic music within communities of participants and interpreters. I focused on the question of representation, abstraction, and the anecdotal in the tradition of musique concrète. I suggested how creative modeling with sampling techniques could be incorporated into historical study, whether in a general survey of Western art music or a more specialized course on contemporary music. This proposal derived from a constructivist framework that emphasizes participatory models of learning, one that links knowledge formation to problem solving and making. Because I approached this topic from the position of a history survey, I also examined how 2 leading textbooks and score anthologies published by Norton and Oxford present the emergence and development of electronic music. More specifically, I wanted to see how they discussed the availability of new amateur modes of musicking made possible by electronic and digital technology, as this phenomenon offers a historical context for the constructivist paradigm I was developing. It seemed to me then, and seems still, that several problems in teaching electronic music show up in conspicuous and distinctive ways in these sources. And as I talk about them, I'll refer to Burkholder's revision of Grout and Poliska as Burkholder, and Richard Truscott and Christopher Gibbs, The Oxford History of Western Music, as Truscott-Gibbs. Used heuristically, these textbooks help to open up a dialogue with pedagogy that is not merely autoethnographic at the level of this is what I tend to do, or that attributes agency to no one in particular at the level of instructors tend or might tend to do this. These sources stand in as representative possible approaches to teaching large-scale historical developments as well as specific subjects. An additional benefit, of course, is that they present stories that many instructors do tell students. Both in my introduction and in today's talk, I focus on historiographical attitudes and methods that shape the selection of material, rather than criticizing the textbooks for lacking a complete or comprehensive account beyond the scope of a single volume survey. In particular, I want to avoid nitpicking of the variety that would demand, where is Bernard Parmigiani, where is Eliane Radigue, where is Alvin Lucier? I will be talking about an omission, but it's one that points to a larger and I hope more interesting historiographical problem. The difficulty lies in the relationship between specialist and generalist discourses, how to locate the boundaries between the two, and how to determine what is required to make a phenomenon intelligible within a general perspective. I'm interested in the status of the conceptual and the theoretical in descriptions of technological innovation. That is, how decisions, actions, and developments are read to varying degrees in technological and conceptual terms. To get started, I'll consider how one specialist study handles this conceptual level. Jing Wang launches her recent book on Chinese sound art with a quick survey of various models of sound. Sound has been interpreted as numbers, Pythagoras, vibration, Galileo, objects, Pierre Schaeffer, sonic flux, Cox, waves, Helmreich, and events, O'Callaghan. Wang proposes a new model, Qi philosophy, that will allow what is most essential in Chinese sound art to resonate. With breathing and resonance as its center, Qi philosophy connects with ideas of tacit resonance, inward expansion, and qualities of the quiet and the bland, and the elusive and the evasive. Yet Qi philosophy, as Jing Wang develops it, does not occupy a theoretical position like other competing concepts of sound. Because for Wang, Qi is not theoretical in the way that other concepts of sound are. Quote, I'm not proposing Qi philosophy as an alternative theory because the very term theory must be questioned. Theories encapsulate abstract and generalized phenomena, while chi thinking suggests, hints, and insinuates. Theories are related to truth, while chi thinking is eventually about living a life, end quote. This final phrase hints at the correlation between John Cage's Eastern philosophical influences and Wang's interpretive concerns. If chi philosophy is not theoretical, we can call it conceptual, at least in the analytical and hermeneutic uses given to it by Wang in her study, whose title, Half Sound, Half Philosophy, points to the conceptual aspect of any artistic practice. What is the need for a conceptual account of sound in teaching electronic music? How much philosophy do we need, particularly in a survey course? To invoke Arthur Danto's theory of the art world, to what extent should we engage with the atmosphere of artistic theory that surrounds musical developments, making them possible and intelligible? Disciplinary transformations have pushed questions like these to the center. These include the destabilizing of music and the musical work through the sonic art, sound art, new media art, and the like, as well as the multidisciplinary impact of sound studies, audio culture, auditory culture, and media archaeology, indicated, for example, by the migration of acoustomology from Stephen Feld's ethnomusicological work into sound studies. The desirability of having an appropriate set of concepts seems obvious when encountering a potentially unfamiliar practice such as contemporary Chinese sound art. Jing Wang's core claim is not that chi philosophy is somehow universal, but rather that knowledge of it ideally opens up experiences and forms of understanding that other conceptual models of sound would not make available. I would like to consider concepts of sound and the atmosphere of artistic theory and how one moment in the history of electronic music history is presented in Burkholder and Taruskin-Gibbs. We can't avoid musique concrète in any history of 20th century music, as it establishes a basis for using recorded sound and sampling as a creative practice. Burkholder and Taruskin-Gibbs present the advent of the practice in institutional terms. That is, rather than precedents such as Walter Ruttmann's experiment in blind cinema, Weekend of 1930, or Halim El-Dab's The Expression of Czar from 1944, the site of invention is Paris radio and the work of Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre Henry. Here is Burkholder's account. As new technologies developed, musicians explored their potential. No technology promised more far-reaching changes for music than the electronic recording, production, and transformation of sounds. These technologies were first exploited in art music, but ultimately became more significant for film and popular music beginning in the 1960s. One approach was to work with recorded sounds, taking the entire world of sound as potential material for music, manipulating the chosen sounds through mechanical and electronic means, and assembling them into collages. Pierre Schaeffer, who pioneered music of this type at Radio Diffusion Française, French radio in Paris in the 1940s, named it musique concrète because the composer worked with concrete sounds themselves rather than with music notation. Schaeffer's first experiments, 5 études de bruit, five studies of noise, for phonograph, were premiered at a concert in Paris in 1948. A little bit fuzzy in the detail there, essentially correct. There was a private audition before it was transmitted on the radio. He then collaborated with Pierre Henry to create the first major work of musique concrète, Symphonie pour un homme seul, Symphony for One Man, premiered in a 1950 radio broadcast. Read that a little bit quickly so we can keep moving. A lot of text there. This is followed in Burkholder by a paragraph on magnetic tape techniques that is not specific to Schaeffer, but describes some of the basic techniques of tape manipulation. Again, a wall of text. Here's the corresponding passage from Taruskin-Gibbs. And again, I'll move through this a little bit quickly. From the beginning, composers formed themselves into two main camps regarding electronic music, one wanting to encompass the whole universe of life sounds from the real world into their music, and the other seeking to create artificially new sounds. Those using real-world sounds came first chronologically. They were the French composers of musique concrète, a music that was based on its relationship to the sound world of concrete sensory reality. The term was coined in 1948 by Pierre Schaeffer, a sound engineer in Paris. His first concrete compositions, made by montaging sounds from phonograph discs, included Concert de Bruit, which itself included Étude au chemin de fer and Étude aux casseroles, together with sound engineer Pierre Henry, and we might want to add Jacques Poulain, a figure who is never mentioned in general accounts. Schaeffer founded the Groupe de Recherche de Musique Concrète and began issuing fully formed compositions of the Musique Concrète studio was Pierre Schaeffer. I'm adding a little bit interpreters on tape, even though it was a mixed work with live performers initially. Then enacts The Death of Orpheus, Torn Limb from Limb. Many prominent avant-gardists, including Messiaen, Boulez, Xenakis, Stockhausen, and Berio, paid visits to Schaeffer's studio at Paris Radio to experiment. Had to extrapolate or to interpolate just a little bit of additional detail. Then, as is traditional in these narratives, German electronic music is presented as a foil to Musik Konkret. The other camp, those wanting to create artificial new sounds, were more interested in the new sound possibilities offered by electronic instruments. Elektronische Musik, to use the original German term, referred to music based exclusively on electronically synthesized sounds. The purer, the better. Synthetic sounds carried no negative prior associations, unlike the amusing or terrifying noises of Musik Konkret, reminiscent of radio sound effects or film and cartoon soundtracks. For composers in the Germanic modernist orbit, the neutrality of synthesized sound, its freedom from worldly associations, was its chief appeal. Okay. So as soon as this institutional origin is established, it disappears from both narratives. What the institution would become, the GRM, the Groupe de Recherche Musicale, which Schaeffer reconstituted from the GRMC in 1958, in fact, is not named. Instead, what I've characterized as a narrative relay occurs. We observe how sampling practices, along with other foundational techniques of electronic music, spread into popular culture, with the narrative thread picked up at various points with the Beatles, Danger Mouse, turntablism, and techno, among others. This relay is clearly stated in the wrap-up of the discussion of electronic music in Burkholder. Electronic music, whether played in concert or distributed in the form of recordings for private listening, attracted a relatively small devoted audience without gaining broad popularity. Yet it became a potent tool in music for film and television, and most of the music produced today, especially popular music, uses technology developed by the pioneers of electronic music. The narrative afterlife of the invention of Musik Konkret is defined by popular culture, which is rarely an arbiter of what counts in either narrative, in either textbook before the late 20th century. But a concept is missing. Where is the acousmatic? Hopefully, this is a different type of question from asking about the absence of Bernard Parmigiani or Luc Ferrari or any other number of later composers. Is the concept of the acousmatic significant enough outside of electronic music and sound studies to justify the additional word count it would devour in a general narrative? A quick look at the index in virtually any recent book on electronic music will show how central the term is for the field. At what point, as we zoom out into the generalist perspective, is the acousmatic no longer necessary or even useful for an understanding of electronic music? And in what ways should we bring the concept back into an undergraduate survey course? The absence of the acousmatic raises questions of historical narrative as well as subject matter, and I'll focus on two main points. First, the acousmatic involves the theoretical side of Schaeffer's project, which neither text discusses. The absence of the acousmatic marks the absence of Schaeffer's analysis of listening models in his treatise on musical objects from 1966. It marks the absence of phenomenology, of figures such as Bergson, Husserl, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty that would position Schaeffer's experimental process within a conceptual field. The acousmatic would point to reduced listening and the sound object as essential aspects of composing in an acousmatic situation as Schaeffer understood it. To trope Wang's title, discussions of Musik Konkret in the history of sampling without reference to the acousmatic seem to be all sound, no philosophy. A second point, of course, the acousmatic gained currency after the early period of Musik Konkret from 1948 to 1953, which is discussed by both texts. The term therefore involves the historical consequences, the narrative afterlife of Schaeffer's work. Acousmatic music competed with, and for many composers and theorists replaced Musik Konkret as a descriptor of the music produced by figures associated with the GRM in the 1970s, most notably Francois Bayle. In my introductory chapter, I mentioned the potentially anachronistic sense of invoking Musik Konkret to describe music composed in the late 1980s and early 2000s that uses sampling. The absence of the acousmatic points to the virtual absence of fixed media electroacoustic music after the 1960s in both narratives. More generally, it points to the rupture caused by electronic music to the practice of the art music tradition, of the literate art music tradition, as Truscott calls it. Perhaps this absence reveals a stress point in the role of music history surveys within music programs that are mainly populated by performance majors. Is fixed media electroacoustic music useful, practically, economically, for performance students? Mixed media works that combine live performance with tape or computer, by contrast, seem more relevant and figure just slightly more prominently in these textbooks. Does the absence of the acousmatic also suggest that theorization of listening is not important for performers? Some final observations. Musique concrète is presented in both accounts as a technological innovation with a corresponding set of techniques. They show Schaeffer developing a technical approach to manipulating sound rather than developing an experimental musical practice in dialogue with the visual arts, science, literature, philosophy, and other fields. More critically, there is the possibility of some misdirection in the emphasis on collages made from real-world sounds in musique concrète. This characterization risks turning a feature that Schaeffer experienced as a persistent challenge or obstacle into an aesthetic goal or even a solution. The challenge for him was the specter of the dramatic and the anecdotal, to transform and, if possible, remove the real-world referential indexical quality of sounds. The path for Schaeffer was from the concrete to the abstract. This was how musique concrète would join and compete with the company of other forms of modern music. A necessary step, which is conceptual, aesthetic, philosophical, in this process has been skipped over. Reduced listening, the strategic isolation of the fragment into a sliver or an atom, the sound object. A later stage of the compositional process, collage or montage, the creation of syntax and form, enters these accounts before we learn that the real-world signatures will have been transformed, even pulverized, before this assemblage begins. Truscott and Gibbs contrast musique concrète and electronische Musik in terms of abstraction, artificially new sounds, and representation, the whole universe of life sounds from the real world, as if Schaeffer was not also concerned with creating an abstract rather than dramatic or anecdotal form of music. Schaeffer, like the composers of electronische Musik, explored the possibility of a music characterized by freedom from worldly associations. That's a quotation. Perhaps this line of development becomes clear only if the narrative continues, prodded along with the term acousmatic, into Schaeffer's stronger assertion of abstraction with his 1959 set of object studies. Surely this creative friction between the abstract and the mimetic, so strikingly expressed in Schaeffer's journals and theoretical writings from the early journals through his 1966 treatise, is essential to understand the conception of musique concrète. But perhaps my observations belong to what Americans are fond of calling inside baseball. Perhaps the details of Schaeffer's project and the development of electroacoustic music this project helped to initiate are not necessary to understand the broad outlines of the paradigm shift to which the later history of sampling-based music belongs. Yet I miss the atmosphere of artistic theory that the concept of the acousmatic would bring to this narrative. The conceptual aspect of literate art music in both textbooks is more richly textured than that of sound in electronic music. And perhaps this is true of many survey courses as well. In my dialogue with instructors and these textbooks, I would point to musique concrète as an example in which the technological requires this conceptual, aesthetic, and theoretical atmosphere. As a final attempt to make the case that this is a real problem, I would mention that I could have written a completely different yet also quite similar paper on the absence of the concept of the soundscape, branching out into field recording and acoustic ecology in both textbooks. But that paper will have to wait for another occasion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Blake, for your very, very insightful presentation and a lot of food for thoughts. I would ask Lee now if you can join us. Okay, just one moment.
I'm trying to share the screen there, Giacomo. I apologize. Let's see if
thank you.
Here we go.
Okay.
I've got the full screen again.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm ready to go. So, can you see this?
Perfect. You have only to put it in presentation mode.
Yeah, exactly. Here we go. Right, I shall start by thanking Giacomo, Laura, Valentina, and all others involved in RiSME organizing this for the invitation. And of course, to Blake for inviting me in the first place. I'd like to congratulate Blake as well, as I was fully unaware of his appointment at BEDA, which is quite laudable. And also thank him for the talk he just gave, which we could talk about for the rest of this session for sure. When Blake invited me to contribute to the book, I had to choose a topic, and we negotiated about that. And we thought that the idea of my views of pedagogy of electroacoustic music for the 21st century would probably be the best bet. And I told him that I would discuss holistic pedagogy. And that chapter, for those who have not seen the book, ended up in a separate section, which is either condemning it to have been an awful mistake, or perhaps celebrating the fact that it really does kind of stand on its own. I leave that to others to decide. Now, giving this talk is a bit of a challenge because I'm assuming some people have read the chapter, but I'm assuming equally that others have not. And therefore, I think it's rather essential that I do try to introduce the main concepts that I launched in the chapter, which was entitled, "It's Not Just About History, and by the way, which history?" Now, before talking about the chapter, I just want to mention a term I launched in 2007 in my MIT book, Understanding the Art of Sound Organization, namely the sound-based music paradigm. First, sound-based music was a term I created in that book because I found something wrong with every term we were using at the time, such as electronic music, electroacoustic music, sound art or sound arts, and so on and so forth, and definitely computer music, which by 2007 had no meaning at all anymore. One of the consequences of having a paradigm, that is, a body of knowledge that one could relate to the production of sound-based music, of its theoretical underpinnings, its aesthetics, and so on and so forth, set it next to the note-based music paradigm, which all of you are certainly familiar with. And this had consequences. For example, a lot of electroacoustic music is not necessarily art music or necessarily pop music, and normally not folk music. It could be a combination of them. It could also stand on its own. So as much of what I'm going to say today, potential food for thought. So how I set the scene in the chapter was by taking examples that I'd experienced internationally, rather exaggerated examples, to be fair, to demonstrate why I thought one might reconsider modes of creating a curriculum. So there were three generic examples, starting with an undergraduate program in music, where its history was taught chronologically, which meant in many cases internationally, one was introduced to 20th and 21st century music at the end of a second year of perhaps a 3 or perhaps a 4-year course. Now, somebody who wants to do new music and has to wait 2 years to get introduced to it is derailed. And that's just one example of silliness that I have discovered in my career. The second one was a module that was called Theory, but in fact was teaching something like Max or PD, which I consider to be a tool for music production, not necessarily a theory or based on a theory, although I do commend Miller, Puckett, and all the others who have made these tools for us. And in such modules, I always wonder to what extent are aesthetics or analytical skills introduced? By teaching a tool on its own, it becomes isolated, which is typical for music curricula, which have theory modules, history modules, particular thematic modules, and performance modules and composition modules, and so on and so forth. The third and last thing in setting the scene was an elective or an option module for a music major or somebody outside of music, which by definition means the coverage of electroacoustic music is going to be reduced. So what types of selection criteria does one choose to open the door to the wide and broad world in which electroacoustic music resides? I've also wanted to mention an issue to start off with, which is a lot of educational organizations still today, whether university or conservatoire, continue to demand things like counterpoint and keyboard harmony for entrance. A lot of sound-based music does not demand musical literacy in any form at all. Obviously, a number of institutions do not demand these things. But the question is, what is the ideal background for the study of this form of music? Obviously, horizontal thinking, also known as counterpoint, and vertical thinking, also known as harmony, are very useful knowledge no matter what kind of music you make. But it's not necessarily obligatory, nor other things that tend to be the standards that we've inherited from the 20th and perhaps the 19th century. So the crux of the matter is that we have a choice between an a la carte menu, which I just described with the separate theory, the separate history, and so on and so forth, or a holistic menu in a curriculum where various aspects can be introduced in the same module or course, or however you call it. Now, I do want to mention, since you guys, most of you are in Italy, that in Europe, we had the Bologna Agreement quite a few years ago, which one of its spin-offs was that music education should not have practice in a conservatorio and a theory at the university and a huge distance between the two, but instead should ensure that practice and theory are shared and optimized by all. For our American colleagues at this meeting today, obviously, that's standard practice at universities as it is in the UK and Ireland. But fortunately, I'm very happy to see Europe going in this direction. And because of this, we can use terms such as the thinking musician. That is a musician who knows about the context, who knows about the theories, and so on and so forth, as well as the practicing musicologist. I've met quite a few musicologists in my life who might have been pianists or whatever in their young age, but are talking about forms of music that they've never practiced in their lives, which, well, you can conclude on your own what I think about that. The next thing I just want to mention briefly is often to my colleagues and my students, or when I give talks, I talk about a triangle that possesses three nodes: the arts, the humanities, and technology. The arts perhaps symbolizing creativity. Alongside humanities, we have the social sciences, just think of ethnomusicology. And with technology, we can't ignore science. Now, given the nature of electroacoustic music, I've often asked the question, is our field music technology, or music technology? And in that case, is it an interdiscipline, to take a word from Pierre Schaeffer, for those who know his traité? The subtitle was Essai interdiscipline. I, for one, am a music technology person, although I know a lot about technology, I don't develop it. A lot of papers at the ICMC is music technology for sure. And there are a few people on this earth who have equal strengths in music and technology, but bless them all. So these are things that one needs to keep in mind when creating a curriculum in our field. A further point I want to raise at this point of my talk is taking local circumstances into account. How much time does one have to teach in the subject area? What types of equipment are available or are needed? And here's one that you might not expect, but what are the roles of the field where it's being taught? Is this more a vocational course? Is it more a liberal arts course? Is it a course that is so eclectic that it has people with popular music backgrounds and formal traditional music training and so on and so forth? All of these aspects go into the mix of what I consider to be an ideal curriculum, whether it's at course, module level, or an entire course. And so to get closer to the title, given the breadth of our world of sonic creativity, which history shall we teach? Now, clearly, Taruskin and Grout are the two key Anglophone texts, and we have two fairly, if not extremely conservative groups of authors there who can't quite get past 1952, as Blake so poignantly brought forward. Acousmatic music was just a few years later and lapped musique concrète in 2 or 3 years. So why that's all not there is because those people aren't interested, and why there isn't much of a public is because such people are writing the books that are still being read in universities, which is a fallacy. But that's just my thought. So continuing with the a la carte versus holistic menu, given the breadth of sonic creativity, which history should and can be offered, in my view, is it's highly advantageous to demonstrate the breadth of what's going on within sonic creativity in order to have people, that is students, discover the paths they prefer to pursue. In other words, in being introduced to loads of music they might not be familiar with, some will stick, some won't. For example, I, as a student, was not overwhelmed by the elektronische Musik, not only due to its abstraction and these so-called pure sounds that were mainly kind of ugly. Obviously, 10 years later, that had been solved and then some. But there are aesthetics that one easily absorbs and digests, and others that one learns to approve of and appreciate and understand as time goes on. And I think having that full choice is very important. So let's take an example of acousmatic and noise music communities. I would suggest that the majority of courses of electroacoustic music around the world, regardless of Blake's frustration, introduce acousmatic music. I would suggest that a large percentage of programs do not spend much time on noise. If one looks at the consumption of electroacoustic music internationally, I would suggest that the audience for noise is much larger than the audience for acousmatic music. The reasons for this we don't have time to discuss, but are to do with the fact that the noise levels in popular music have gone up over the years, the loudness levels, and noise was an obvious application of things that were going on in popular music and things that were going on with composers like Gottfried Michael König. And the noise communities are really very dynamic and very interested in terms of their communities of interest and their communities of practice. But again, which is being taught? I would suggest that both be introduced. Regarding analysis, this is just a little detour, but that always forms part of music education. Are we talking about the analysis of production, which is Laura Zatra's specialization? She's one of the greatest scholars in that field. And or the analysis of the listening experience, something that Simon Emerson and I have been involved with for quite a long time. Answer, probably the best way to introduce analysis is to introduce both. So I'm just going to briefly suggest 2 examples of holistic analysis in Emerson and my book with Cambridge. We introduced the 4-part question, the last part of which was, for whom is an analysis intended? Meaning you could make analysis for schools, you could make analyses for noise enthusiasts, you can make analyses for a final year exam, and so on and so forth. My point is that through a better understanding of analysis, you could make this kind of music much more inclusive. The second example I want to cite today is the TASEM project by Michael Clark and his colleagues, housed at Huddersfield University in this country. What Michael and his colleagues have come up with, and there's a recent Oxford book that I recommend to everybody, where he's really taken this research to a high point, covering a significant number of works, is that the person reading it, the analyst, is put in the driving seat of the composer when investigating a piece, and is in a similar condition of the composer making decisions with various tasks and aspects and parameters of making music. A fantastic holistic approach to analysis. Now, in the chapter, I make a remark that, in my view, it is erroneous to have separate modules and training for composers, for performers, and scholars. Why do I feel this? Well, it should be reasonably obvious by now, but the main answer is due to the fact that the métier of an electroacoustic musician, and we must not forget that most electroacoustic musicologists are also practicing musicians who are responsible for their own dissemination, means that they have to understand, ideally, to be the holistic musician or the holistic scholar, the historical and contextual, the socio-political aspects, the theoretical aspects, the technological aspects, the scientific aspects, the performative aspects, the aspects of production, and the aspects of dissemination. So why not put these all together? Before I illustrate this, I just want to make one short remark that I think there are benefits of having concentrated forms of teaching, which are sometimes called the project system or block teaching. People become immersed in a shorter period of time for more hours a day or more hours per week in a subject. If treated holistically, you can keep switching subjects during the day so you can see how they all fit together. And by dealing with it on a 2 to 3 day a week basis for a period of 5 to 6 weeks, you are really living the subject. And that's a form of education that I believe in. So how to achieve this vision? Well, in the chapter, I decided to do that empirically. And so I came up with 4 situations: a general music curriculum, a specialist music curriculum, an elective or an optional module, and even a curriculum for extended education for adults or for schools, for young people. And the idea was to take an item, a theme. If I had pick up where Blake left off, the notion of acousmatic would work. But the one I used in the chapter that I wrote for Blake was the gesture. Those who are specialists in electroacoustic music will probably think of Dennis Smalley, as he spent so much time and so many pages on discussing gesture as a form of electroacoustic musical gesture. And in my book for teachers and for kids, Making Music with Sounds, gesture was placed right after the sound object and before a musical segment, because it's an interim step. So if you think of Schaeffer, he was dealing with the musical and the sound object. Dennis Smalley took us to the next level of gesture, which is really quite common in acousmatic music, but not so common in electronic music. And then we build upwards from that. And the idea is that in a general music curriculum, you could talk about gesture in Haydn as well as in Parmigiani, and you could learn how it evolved historically, what it means for those that are interested in cross arts education, how the musical gesture and the physical gesture have something to do with each other, et cetera, et cetera. In an electroacoustic curriculum, just as in a music curriculum, you could be making musical gestures, discussing, criticizing, analyzing musical gestures. Even in a short elective module, you could combine theory, history, practice, analysis. And I am the director of the EARS 2 project, which is an e-learning environment, which you can all find easily online. And thank you, Valentina, for the traduzione in Italian. This is for kids from 11 to 14 in particular, but has been used for 8 to 80. And here again, the musical gesture is introduced for young people, and they all get it, and they're all happy to try to make such things. Before concluding, I thought I would add just a few subjects, again, as part of food for thought. Now, Taruskin, no, I think it was in the Grout, Burkholder, said that this music had a micropublic. And of course, anybody who knows my books know that since the early 90s, I've been writing about against the marginalization of experimental music and electroacoustic music. And I don't think that that marginalization is necessarily needed. Now that I'm 25 years later, or 35 years later even, a lot has been done, and I don't talk about its being marginal anymore. Some of those presented as art music continue to be relatively marginal, but through all sorts of research, such as our Intention Reception Project, the Something to Hold On To factor that I published about, the fact that UNESCO asked me to create the Ears To website and that it's used internationally in schools, means that sound-based music is infinitely more accessible than most people think. It just depends on how it's introduced and made welcome to people. So it has an inclusive nature, and there are many communities of interest and increasing communities of practice, to borrow a term from Benga. Furthermore, I think there's a great educational opportunity. Normally, we're taught music individually, particularly as composition. But within electroacoustic music, there are forms that are open to collaboration. Improvisation was mentioned with respect to Francesco's work and live electronic performance. I've seen him work with groups, and he makes magic happen. With DIY instruments that my colleague John Richards is an expert in, and in sampling, which is my own domain. This is a means of making learning experience exciting by having people working together, sharing materials, constructing things, and that heightens ownership. And when you heighten ownership in education, you heighten interest. So why don't we do that more often? In a book recently completed by John Richards and myself, which is new under review, so I can't yet tell you who's going to publish it, where I talk about sampling and he talks about DIY instrument making, and he calls it DIT, do it together, not do it yourself. The book called The Music of Sounds and the Music of Things, we propose that sampling and DIY instrument making should become forms of 21st century folk music. Because it's open to all, and it doesn't necessarily have to be hierarchical. Therefore, the socio-cultural aspects of electroacoustic music and their relationship with musical dramaturgy are of great, great importance. I often give talks about art for life's sake as a reaction to art for art's sake, because art for art's sake is absolutely what marginalized the music we love. A final thought before my final word on today's and tomorrow's music education. Music education traditionally has been a celebration of the known. It focuses on the past and does its best to focus on the present, but many of you work with colleagues who are historical musicologists who tell you the contemporary music cannot be taught because it has no history. Frankly, music education should equally be about the future. Bertolt Brecht is known for telling us that art is a means of challenging society. Why isn't music education a means of informing us to become inquisitive about how to challenge society through our music? I think in our field we have plenty of opportunities for that. Thus, a final word. What I've been trying to say is that sound-based music is an inclusive, accessible area and deserves a pedagogical approach that is as forward-looking as is most of the music itself. It is as much a part of music education as it is a part of new media education, but it can also be very much a part of artificial intelligence education, climate change education, and much more, as long as holism is at its heart. Grazie. I'm now finished.
Thank you very much to Lilendi for this very broad and in-depth discussion, which has opens up many questions that I'm sure that we will discuss in the final Q&A, because there were so many thoughts and things opened. Thank you very much, Lee, for that. I now give the word to Kate Galloway.
Great, thank you. Let me just. Okay, thanks everyone for being with us today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about an offshoot from my chapter, and essentially where my chapter came from, because part of what I've done in a lot of my courses over the past decade is like look for electronic music in unexpected places. I've been teaching in music programs that don't have a traditional music history sequence of any sorts for about a decade now. I currently teach classes that fit within a Bachelor of Science in Music that's very music technology and media focused, an electronic arts program, and an interdisciplinary critical game development program. And so a lot of my classes have, when they're talking about music, it's often in a various different kind of audiovisual context in particular. So that's just kind of to frame a little bit of where I'm coming from today in some of the unexpected places I want to talk about from some of my current classroom work. As Danielle Sofer asserts in their article, Categorizing Electronic Music, once we choose what to include, our methods of organizing musical records have profound effects on how musical categories circulate, which in turn influences whose work is represented. So when I teach out to teach electronic music, broadly defined, or incorporate electronic music case studies into my courses, I'm considering the broadest possible categorization of what electronic music is or could be, especially to my students, and how we are collectively encountering electronic musics in the ubiquitous listening experiences and mediated spaces of our everyday lives. And so today I'm going to touch on two case study interventions that I make in the classroom to challenge what my students think of as electronic music, how they're categorizing electronic music, how they're encountering different aesthetics of electronic music, and then how they might be encountering electronic music in unexpected everyday spaces. So the first has to do with internet memes as a ubiquitous space where there is a lot of kind of electronic music and a lot of drawing on past and present electronic music aesthetics. And the internet is a fascinating space to encounter this participatory remixing practices, sharing and listening to electronic and digital music, ideas of it and aesthetics of what electronic music is across social media. However, these user creators are not always deliberately or consciously engaging with electronic music practices. They're drawing on aesthetics they've heard elsewhere from ways in which electroacoustic music has been used in popular film, and kind of building upon that exposure without not necessarily knowing the histories. And then take, for instance, one of my first examples, Haiku the Husky, a popular pet influencer who gained notoriety on the internet with a TikTok post featuring a live living room concert of them howling on command.
Haiku, can you sing?
Commenters made comparisons between haiku and the virtuosic pop singers like Ariana Grande and Cher. But once haiku's owner started beginning adding electronic timbral effects to his vocalizations, including using this wireless karaoke mic that you see with a voice changing feature and built-in loudspeaker, it started accelerating even more. And following the release of Cher's Believe and the treatment of her voice on that track, Believe with the auto-tune effect, we also heard on the internet videos a lot of posters referring to auto-tune or the particular timbral effect on Cher's voice that we know as the Cher effect from popular music studies, being referred to as the haiku effect and building into that history whenever they were hearing his karaoke mic mediated singing, and referentially invoking association with Cher's iconic human machine vocal timbre on Believe to describe this dog's vocal treatment in these videos. And you can hear just another example here. And in that example, they're adding some additional post-production effects with their dog before uploading it to TikTok. And so while many contemporary users of autotune and autotune-like sound processing technologies covertly treat, correct, and shape the voice of the listener out of sight in the studio, there's overt autotune like this can make human singers sound unnatural and perhaps even unhuman. And in this case, the non-human pet sounding even more kind of spatially distant from the human. And so, for example, in 1958, with the Chipmunk song sung by Alvin and the Chipmunks, pitch shifting or increasing the tape recording speed to raise the speech was being used to mask the humanness of the voice actor and craft this non-human vocality. And we hear the same thing here even further. And we know how this became known as the Donald Duck effect or the Chipmunk effect. And Jonathan Stern and Mara Mills have extensively discussed this. When the software or voice filtering technologies are applied to haiku or another non-human animal sounding, listeners are simultaneously reminded of this animal's non-humanness and its proximity to the human as a domesticated member of the family. And I ask my students, think about what is the electronic manipulation of his voice doing in this moment, and how we're supposed to be listening to these videos and these memes, and how we're supposed to be relating to haiku and the dog through this listening experience. And they discuss often how it reveals this strange tension between the pop idol presence and the human animal, between the alien and the mechanic, and all these different kind of listening associations they have to this timbral treatment. Another example that I use when I'm discussing internet videos and electronic music is the Instagram project Animal and Synthesizers by electronic musician Tomar Brook, who presents synthesized sounds for organic beings. And it's a bit different. Recorded using vintage and modern analog synthesizers, Animals and Synthesizers remixes found video footage of nature and non-human videos collected by him across social media accounts that he follows. And his juxtaposition of the gestural movement of the animals with the timbral coloration of synthesizers encourages listeners to reevaluate their preconception of technology and nature as being exclusive from one another, and also to alter human perception of the non-human. And just to hear one example first here. So I found that a lot of my students' early experience with electronic music in various ways has been from sci-fi films and horror films, where early sci-fi composers were exploring the timbral possibilities of electronic instruments like the theremin, uncanny and novel timbres of synthesizers, and other unconventional scoring practices with electronic music to imagine the soundscapes of outer space, the alien, and distant non-human ecologies. In her analysis of the soundscape composer Hildegard Westerkamp's cricket voice, for example, Andrew McCartney found that Westerkamp's approach to mediated sonic intimacy with acoustic environment produced unexpected responses from listeners. Instead of feeling close to or inside the cricket's voice, listeners perceive the cricket as an alien ecology. Such approaches, she says, to intimacy might simultaneously reflect and intensify urban anxieties about the sounds of the alien species that are associated with wilderness environments, McCartney reflected. And I find very similar kind of reception to the animals and synthesizers videos within my students as we start to analyze them collectively. The timbral sonic palette of animals and synthesizer videos results from his exploration and expression of the irregular, constantly changing and unpredictable rhythm of the animal's gestural movements, the atmosphere of their setting, the animal's shape and its color, and how these physical and sensory characteristics might sound. Instead of timbre indexing the instrument's materiality, the correlation between his synth choices and player actions index the sources from various expressive ends. This and particularly focusing on the sonic material of the on-screen animal, as you'll see in this example. So his synth choices index the sonic materiality of the on-screen animal, as I was saying, which, quote, exploiting a sense of uncanny or ambiguous sound sources of various expressive ends, to quote Jonathan D'Souza in his work on timbre, and crafting layers of what Megan Lavengood has referred to as timbral semiotic significance. So when I draw on these examples in, say, my seminar on remix and digital culture, students participate also in their own meme and video creation workshop, where they rapidly discover how easily they fall back on genre conventions and stereotypes when scoring their images to pre-existing or newly composed music, and that making short-form videos like a TikTok remix or a lip dub challenge is actually surprisingly labor-intensive and time-consuming to get it really right and well-coordinated. The second example I'm going to talk about is in video game development and scoring, particularly in the indie domain. And this is getting to some of my work with Indigenous game design development and musical scoring. So in Indians in Unexpected Places, Philip Deloria writes that the custom of imagining Indigenous peoples in terms of, quote, primitivism, technological incompetence, physical distance, and cultural difference has remained familiar currency in contemporary dealings with Native people, end quote. So redressing this conventional narrative, Deloria describes Indigenous peoples as engaged in activities in everyday life, singing opera, driving cars, acting in Hollywood, that often conflict with the expectations and representations by non-Indigenous people in settler societies. So this also includes electronic music and video game scoring and so on. And so when I teach with Elizabeth Leponcier's indie game Thunderbird Strike, featuring score and sound design by multimedia artist Casey Koizen, I encourage my students to think about how the choice of genre and style participates in world building and narrative design and alternate representations. So Thunderbird Strike continues scholar and game designer Leponcier's activist work on decolonizing the game industry and addressing embodied knowledge of the land, turning in this instance to the extractive resource industry. The extractive resource industries are a product and a tool of settler colonialism and capitalism, and the game was created to raise awareness concerning Enbridge Line 5, the Enbridge Line 5 oil pipeline. And in this multi-platform 2D side scroller in 3 levels, users play as the Thunderbird flying from the tar sands in Alberta to the Straits of Mackinac and the Great Lakes, protecting Turtle Island. And so as the Thunderbird, a traditional figure in many Indigenous storytelling traditions, the player recharges in the clouds, as you can see on screen, and calls down searing lightning upon mining company infrastructure, so buildings, pipelines, trucks, machinery of the settler colonial capitalist extractive industry that threatens lands and the waters. But players can also strike lightning at bones of caribou, wolves, and buffalo, which actually bring them back to life. So it's also destabilizing what we think of often like as fighter destructive oriented games and the game mechanics. So the industrial sector, which includes the extractive industry, serves as both the subject matter and the aesthetic foundation. Koizen's use of instrumentation choices, harsher timbres, throbbing bass and drum layers, and post-production that introduces delay, reverb, and distortion sonify the industrial complex of the extractive industries implicated in the gameplay and narrative. His music and sound design is more atmosphere-driven, and his sound work in Thunderbird Strike is informed by personally witnessing mining and toxins buried in the Northwest Territories from his homeland. The dense layers and loops of instrumental and vocal effects evoke the layers of the earth that extend below and beyond the surface, that archive past stories, sounds, lived experiences of the land, and the stratified trauma and ecological harm that lies outside of visible and audible range. We hear Koizen using electronic guitar prepared with distortion and delay for both the game's score and for Thunderbird's sound effects, developing interconnections between the diegetic sonic environment of the in-game action and also the non-diegetic score of each of the levels and the cutscenes. So his choice of electronic guitar, timbral references to industrial music, electroacoustic digital sonic processing effects, all are illustrating how game sound can be indigenous without reproducing stereotypes and what the varied nature of indigenous game sound can sound like. And I just have, this is one still from the gameplay. This is a free open access game. And this is just an excerpt of some of his scoring from one of the cutscenes and Le Pensier's visuals. Many of the courses, as I said at the opening, that I currently teach focus on audiovisual and interactive media. And the students in my current student body range from students who are interested in professional media production, but also those who are working in experimental instrumental design. It's across the spectrum of what music and technology is or could be in the 21st century. And so I wanted to share with you today and contextualize a few of the examples of electronic and digital music in these unexpected places that I've been incorporating alongside more conventional examples, and what results when we continually just diversify and expand our definitions of what electronic music means and is across digital audio production and consumption. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much to Kate Galloway. That was very, very rich, and you mentioned and you brought us artistic experiences and practices that I didn't personally know. So I am really glad to learn new things.
That tends to be what's expected from me.
but that's great. That's really great also. And for bringing also a different perspective on music and electronic music teaching and on its goals and so on. So thank you very, very much for your presentation. And now, last but not least, Francesco Giomi will join us with our last presentation, and thereafter we will have the Q&A where all people will join us in a common discussion. So Francesco, please, here it's your turn.
Hello, everybody. First of all, I want to thank you very much, Giacomo and Laura, for inviting me for this presentation. And also Valentina Bertolani. First of all, I want to say that your work, your musicological work, Giacomo, Laura, and Valentina, is very important for understand the teaching of electronic music. So thank you very much also for that. But I would like to focus my presentation about the teaching electronic music in Italy. First of all, I want to start, first of all, I want to say that why electronic music is important in Italy. I think that from an educational point of view, Italy is really a pioneer country. And I will show how this is true later, but it is very important. It is a very important discipline in the field of music. So first of all, I want to start from a question. What is electronic music today? This is a crucial question, in my opinion. In my opinion, today, electronic music is a sort of galaxy of different creative and technological expressions practiced by millions of musicians, both on the professional and non-professional world. So this is a very crucial aspect because it's very hard. It's very hard to put some borders in the electronic music expression. So we can create a continuous line that from a certain point of view walk along many different expression and way of using technology for sound. In Italy, we are very proud about this word, electronic music, because we use this word in an academic context from the beginning, and we continue to use it today. So for us, electronic music is really a galaxy, is really a different, it's really a set of different expression or different way of conceiving music with technology. Therefore, teaching electronic music in an academic context is a very complex and large field of education with several different targets, approaches, nuances. Just as an example, even though I will show you that in Italy there are many electronic music courses, but they are all different and they are carried out by different teachers who have a very different and polyedric approach to the discipline. I can say that after many decades, from the book by Richard Horton, 1981, very famous book, Electronic Music for Schools, the recent book edited by Black Stevens is perhaps a new fundamental first step to help and increase the community. So I really hope that this book could open new horizons for the theoretical approach to the teaching of electronic music. And I have to say that this new book is really helpful. Electronic music in Italy, now, even though there are many levels of education for electronic music, I am a teacher in the AFAM system, the AFAM national system. Scusate, qualcuno mi ha chiesto di registrare. The AFAM national system for high education in arts and music is the system which runs in Italy, and that includes also the National Conservatory of Music. It is the system of high education for art, design, music, and so on. The first Italian course in this context, in an Italian Conservatory of Music, was founded in Florence by the pioneer of computer music, Pietro Grossi, in 1965, so many years ago. It was followed by several other cities, Turin, 1968, Bologna, 1971, Padua, 1972, Rome, and so on. At that time, the course was given by one teacher, only one teacher. Now, in Italy, we have 73 music conservatories, but there are about 45 music conservatories, including a program of electronic music or similar. 45. In my opinion, it is really a huge number. So Italy is the land of electronic music. At the beginning, as I told you before, at the beginning and for many years, the course of electronic music was not considered an ordinary course. So it was called extraordinary course, and it had different durations, basically 1 or 2 years. And it was considered a sort of additional course with no degree, with no final title. In 1992, finally, electronic music became an ordinary course, but mainly as an extension of the courses of composition or instrument. And again, with a single teacher, which means that I could attend an electronic music course after having a period of composition or a final degree of instrument. In 1999, the very famous 508 law, very famous for Italians, of course, transformed the old system in the new academic system based on the model with 3 + 2 years and with more teachers. This is very interesting because Pietro Grossi, who founded the first electronic music in Italy, also during the 80s spoke about the possibility to have in Italy more teachers for the electronic music course. So he was also a pioneer in this kind of aspect. It is the case of Italy is interesting, in my opinion, from several points of view. One of these is the organizations of the disciplines and the organizations of teachers, because professors are organized into 7 large disciplines. The first is electronic music history. In a certain way, it is considered different from the other 6 because it belongs to the system of music history. But anyway, it is surely a discipline of electronic music. We have here Laura Zatra. She is one of the most important teachers of electronic music history in the Italian conservatory system. Then there are 6 disciplines for professor of electronic music. The first is electroacoustic music performance. Second is electroacoustic music composition. Then we have acoustics, electroacoustics, informatica musicale. I translated it in music technology. As you know, it's a very difficult word to understand, to translate, sorry. So music technology, and then multimedia. So these 7 disciplines represent a very organization of the teaching of electronic music in the AFA system in Italy. This organization is perhaps now a little bit obsolete, but it has guaranteed for 20 years a multidisciplinary and perspectival approach to students, which means that students have several teachers, several competencies, several different approaches or more to the teaching of electronic music. Not in every conservatory of music there are 7 teachers, so sometimes the same teacher must give courses in more than one discipline, of course. the base of the academic educational for electronic music in Italy is the triennial programs, are the triennial programs. They are a basic training for the different branches of electronic music, mainly with a creative approach or a technical approach. Because we have basically the 3 years program in electronic music with a strong compositional focus, or we have a 3 years program for audio technician. It is interesting to underline that they have these 2 different triennial programs have the same code. So for the national system, they are the same type of degree. There is a discussion about this. There is a discussion if audio technique should be included in the system or not. We could discuss this, but this is not the context. Anyway, in Italy, there are some triennial programs for audio engineering. So now it is included in the system. The most joined triennial programs in Italy are Bologna, Florence, Frosinone, Milan, Naples, Turin, Trieste, and others. Sorry if I forgot something. And I have to say that there are hundreds of students in Italy approaching the triennial programs. For example, in Bologna this year, this is a news of 3 days ago, we have about 50 admission, 50 people who wants to study for the first time electronic music. The main goals of a triennial program are interesting to explain. Even though there are many different approaches to the triennial education, we can outline 4 important basic common goals, at least in my opinion. So these goals can be reached during the 3 years. First of all, the developing of a compositional sensitivity. So the students must learn how to manage sound, how to compose sound, how to relate the sound to a structure, and so on. In a few words, a compositional sensitivity. Then they have to develop an analytical sensitivity, which is the ability to understand the listening, to understand the piece, to understand a sound message, and so on. From this point of view, I think that taking things from the book, the article by Marc Battier, Analyzing Electronic Music and Covering the Original Condition of Production, could be very helpful to help teachers in this activity. Then, the third important basic common goal is technological independence. Students have to learn how to manage a studio of electronic music, how to manage an audio system, how to use software, how to use hardware, and so on. So, in a few words, to be independent if they have to go to work in another context, in another school, in another studio, in another country, and so on. From this point of view, it is very good, the article, the book, the issue of the book by Raul Masu and Fabio Monreale, Technology Application as a Pedagogical Tool for Electronic Music. As you can imagine, there are many different technological approaches to develop this kind of independence. And a teacher is different from another. But for me, in my opinion, it's important that students can go outside the school into the real world of festivals, of centers, and so on, and to realize their idea without problems. Finally, the historical awareness, which is very important because electronic music has a very strong history. So it is very important to understand the main figures of the history of electronic music, their work, and how these figures influenced the production of nowadays. The Leland intervention to this conference and his article is not just about history, and by the way, which history article is really good to make a step forward this aspect of historical awareness, in my opinion. So we can see that Black-Stevens' book has a very strong function for these goals, to realize these goals. And it can become an instrument for teachers to have a better education approach to the triennial program. Then we have the biennial programs. The situation here is more confused. In my opinion, the biennial programs is something more linked to a project-oriented model. And it should be able to connect the work of students with the real world. Festival, concert, exhibition, gallery, dance and theater performance, video production, and so on. So during the last 2 years, students, and sometimes things go in this way. In this 2 years program, students should be able to create a relation with the real world and to realize creative products that can be presented in the real world. So in this sense, it is not a mere continuation of the triennial programs. In fact, normally there are some specialization in the biennial programs, for example, electroacoustic music composition, sound design, multimedia, and also others. Every conservatory music has different specialization for the biennial programs, and this is a very rich environment in Italy. So if I want to study a particular discipline, I can go in a school. If I want to study another discipline, I can go in another place, no problem. And this is a very rich situation, in my opinion. This is the opportunity to present one of the last news in the biennial programs in Italy, which is the electroacoustic improvisation course that I founded in Bologna in 2021, and now it is the only one in Italy. So the focus is basically on electroacoustic, on live electroacoustic music and electroacoustic improvisation. So, to conclude my presentations, I want to introduce 2 recent questions. Recent from a certain point of view, but anyway. For me, these 2 questions are central in my work, are crucial, and perhaps we could discuss in the future about the tools to give an answer to the question. How can we teach live electronic music? Live electronic music exists. It is practiced by thousands of people. How can we teach electroacoustic improvisation? These 2 questions are very linked, in my opinion, because the idea of improvisation seems very linked, very strongly linked to the idea of live electronic music and to their instruments. So these are two aspects I am studying and that I want to explore in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco.
Thank you, Francesco, very, very much for your paper, and thanks to all the panelists for their great papers. I think we've had many different perspectives, but all very in-depth, and each of which opened up a series of questions about what electroacoustic music is, which history it has. I mean, which histories. As a plural, it's really, we had a broad spectrum of plurality of approaches and of histories, and then also of why to teach it and how the do it together perspective, for example. So instead of opening myself with a question, I have many questions because of the richness of all the papers. But I'd like also to that the audience that is connected through Zoom, or even the people that follow us on Facebook, they can write comments, and the people here who are on Zoom can raise their hand or even show up and make questions, and even the panelists if they want. Just I let 1 minute if there is someone who shows up. Okay, we have one hand who is from, but you can show us. I don't see who is. I see just the raised hand. So people,
it's me.
Please.
Me,
okay. Okay.
hi.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this like really thoughtful and thought-provoking series of presentations, and especially having them all together in their idiosyncrasy. It's very, very interesting. And I have a couple of questions, but I want to start with just one. And both of the questions start from a reflection on Leland's claim on the importance of circumstances and the specific situation which you're in when you introduce this topic. I thought that was it really triggered my curiosity and influenced my thoughts afterwards. So my first question is for Kate Galloway. And I really enjoyed thoroughly your presentation so much, and I obviously immediately downloaded the game, and I cannot wait to playing with it. So, like, I think you mentioned that you teach, I think you at Rensselaer Institute, which is more media focused. So it's a different situation than teaching in a situation that is very music focused. So I was wondering if you can envision ways. So I was wondering if the beautiful way in which you interact with these extra experiences of electronic sounds, like if you can envision ways in which they can be brought also in situations that in which the courses are very music focused, because in my experience, I don't have tons of experience teaching, unfortunately, but my experience in the Anglosphere is that I had a lot of freedom in introducing freely electronic sounds in pop music courses, but not necessarily when I was hired to teach 20th century and 21st century music. So paradoxically, I had more freedom in pop music courses when it comes to electronic music. So I don't know, I just wanted to know your opinion on that.
No, I can definitely speak to that. Like my training in graduate school was in kind of more, I'd say back in the day, conventional musicology. It was a musicology / ethnomusicology program at the time at the University of Toronto. I was also working on Murray Schafer at the time and site-specific theater. But some of my my teaching there was mostly at the tutorial level, but some of my first experiences when I was doing adjunct teaching afterwards and at my postdoc at Memorial University of Newfoundland, I was within more conventional schools of music within the Canadian system. And that was probably the last time I was teaching in various parts of what would be a music history survey or even world music classes. And so when I was teaching a world music class, or even usually I was assigned like the 20th century and onwards module in the survey, I chose not to teach with a textbook, which I found gave myself immediate freedom, a lot more work up front in terms of cobbling together what readings and what materials I would use. But I didn't have to subscribe to a particular narrative or ordering, or even justify to students why they were purchasing a textbook that I was then supplementing quite heavily with other case studies, or just kind of figuring out what my students were listening to. I also found it in my popular music history classes, which were like popular music history from World War II till whenever. Yeah, there was a lot more freedom. A lot of the institutions I was being hired by already didn't use a textbook in those contexts, so there was like no questions asked. But I had a lot of freedom in kind of building my own course around readings, and increasingly through sources like Musicology Now and a lot of the open access musicology project that's coming out of a couple of scholars I know. I can send links to anyone if you just email me, as well as just kind of looking at kind of more easily accessible or sections of articles for readings has been really beneficial in those more traditional kind of survey environments that I was thrust into, to able to kind of keep a particular kind of narrative of music histories and contemporary music, and bring in more contemporary examples, or examples that are a little off the beaten track, that don't necessarily have a literature established for them yet, and put those in dialogue with each other. And so I kept doing this when I was, before I came to Rensselaer, I was at Wesleyan University for a few years in a visiting position, and was also kind of teaching in a music department that was a music department, but also a little kind of experimental in what it does, and kind of kept the same methods going. And essentially at RPI, I'm essentially the music history and ethnomusicology person. And so I've got a lot of freedom over what I do and how I do it. And I'm the person I answer to. But there is this really fluid idea of like what music is, and it's kind of a really nice space to be here and do this. But I find that kind of reintroducing some of the traditional examples is more of what I have to do to kind of keep my students on path of kind of putting experimental and contemporary examples into dialogue with a history, because they tend to be really rich listeners, but they definitely don't have a particular kind of music history background. And so I'm kind of working in the opposite realm within that freedom. Yeah. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me and we can have some dialogue and email, because yeah, it's kind of, I've had that luxury of kind of interpretive space and kind of have just kind of gone with it.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Do we have other questions from the public? I don't see.
I have a question. It's more like a comment than a question, since some of you have also mentioned my name. And I want to refer to one slide showed by Francesco Giomi, where there was the titles of the courses that we give to our students in the Conservatory of Music in Italy. And just point out the fact that the history of electroacoustic music is not inside the group of topics related to the making of electroacoustic music. So my code is related to the history of music the normal traditional musicology and history that we make inside the conservatories. And I'm not part of the groups of people and teachers that are teaching how to do live electronics, how to learn softwares, how to compose acoustic music, etc. The strange and funny thing is that I'm a little alone in Italy because I'm neither part of the so-called traditional musicologists and historians who do not consider the history of electronic music this a serious topic sometimes, and also on the other hand, so I'm a little bit in the middle. So my question is not a question, it's just a comment perhaps. Is there the same situations in other places around the world where the historians are a little isolated and in between the traditional musicologists and the ones who make electroacoustic music? I don't know, Lee, what do you think?
I think it's a very important point, Laura. You're absolutely right. Of course, as I said, you're one of the few who are not primarily practitioner doing the musicology. So there's that aspect. And I did mention towards the end of my talk, these more traditional musicologists that think new music have no history. But I think the point I would make, which I've discussed with Marc Battier quite often, is that there has been very, very little communication between note-based musicologists and sound-based musicologists. There have been no discussions about best practice that can be shared across the areas. And there's been a great deal of ignoring, perhaps founded by books like Taroskin and all this that almost reject it as being not of any interest. I don't know what the reasons are, but there seems to be a too great segmentation between electroacoustic musicology and the rest. But let us not forget, Laura, that there is often animosity between ethnomusicologists and Western art music musicologists. They can be fierce because they're precious about their areas. And of course, most ethnomusicologists, or at least when I was a student, were dealing with traditional music, not the modern versions of commercialized musics of the world. And they're trying to protect these things from becoming extinct. So I remember a ethnomusicologist once telling a Chinese student who said that there was a piano in every room at Central Conservatory in Beijing. He said, "Why do you have pianos? Why don't you just uphold your Chinese tradition? You don't need Western piano." So I think this tension continues. And if we take a European country, Germany, the word Fach, which is vocation, is extremely integral to German thought. So you get stereotyped as something, and then you should not be doing the other thing. Obviously, with the interdisciplinarity of today's world, that should be redundant, but it lives on. And I think your problem is worthy of a whole, symposium. Why is there no synergy between these areas when they can actually help each other? It's international. It's not just Italy, for sure.
Thanks. Thank you.
Other
Yeah.
questions?
Juan Parra, hello, please.
Hi, sorry, I thought I was gonna sit this one in, but Laura's comment and your presentation kind of triggered me because I really appreciate all the angles and all the presentations, but there was something that I think resonates with Laura's anxiety a little bit, and I've also kind of find myself alone many times because I'm more a computer and electronic music practitioner, and in all these years, it seems to be that one of the things that education still kind of seems to miss the opportunities to incorporate the understanding and appreciation of the repertoire and the history of electronic music through the most obvious and banal method, which is borrow a page of traditional instrumental education and make electronic musicians to learn how to play repertoire, how to understand through making, and not having to wait till, let's say, professional life sometimes gives them the opportunity to specialize tape piece or reconstruct one patch in Max for one particular concert, but actually make it part of the educational program, because by emphasizing that aspect through doing and through understanding to practitioners, also you expand this notion that we're all composers and we only learn techniques, or we relate to history from a, let's say, academic musicological perspective, which is important, but it doesn't help to bring a sense of community, which I think that is one of the things that we need to keep developing. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. And my question would be, if from the didactic perspective, how will you think about going about creating a repositories and repertoire that with the intention of expanding the performance of this work rather than just preserving it in the archival sense?
Quite a deep question. I let the panelists try to answer. It's a very complicated one. I can guess, but I don't know if Francesco or Blake or Lee or Kate want to try to deal with.
Could I maybe, rather than answering that question, which isn't quite within my domain, could I maybe build on the question and direct it towards Francesco, because I think it's a fantastic question, and I think it relates to perhaps the problem or at least the issue of pluralism in our four talks, right? That we've mapped out vastly different terrain, which makes holism a challenge, as Lee has suggested how important a holistic perspective is in training. Pluralism and holism, these seem in tension. And what I'm really curious about with Francesco, with your project of electroacoustic improvisation, is how you deal with stylistic pluralism. How do you coordinate electroacoustic improvisation when what electroacoustic means is so incredibly rich and vast? So what are some of the first steps that you take when you bring musicians together to improvise?
The field of electroacoustic improvisation is very big and complex. I studied it in the last 4 or 5 years, and I practiced it in the last 15, 20 years. But every day some new question arises. So what style, what language of electroacoustic improvisation, what is improvisation in this case? It is difficult to answer, but I can say we teach free improvisation in the historical sense. The improvisation that was born in the Euro-American context after the Second World War, in particular during the 60s. And not, for example, the improvisation that comes from the Afro-American section of improvisation. This is a way of seeing things. Another way is to speak about non-idiomatic improvisation. In the Derek Bailey sense. So improvisation that is not jazz, that is not other type of idiomatic improvisation. But for examples, and this is my approach, improvisation is different from some practice by Cage or Stockhausen. And for example, electroacoustic improvisation is inclusive of many other idioms, for example. So I don't have a real good answer. I can only say what I'm doing. I'm doing a path in non-idiomatic improvisation related to Euro-American tradition and with many connections with different improvisers, musicians, composers, and so on. I try to summarize everything in a recent book, came out in Italy last year, Musica Imprevedibile, but of course there are many aspects that are not included in the book. So as I told you at the end of my presentation, it is a field for studying. There are questions, and because it is completely new, so I try to study and to teach with this point of view.
Maybe I can contribute at this point regarding Juan's question. Francesco has articulated this very beautifully, because the backgrounds of our students, the interests of our students, and the pluralism in today's music, you could say it negatively. It has grown so much that it's hard to cluster some things together. And so we as educators have this responsibility of introducing this enormous breadth, when in fact the breadth is even bigger than we know, because there's a lot that we don't know. So in a sense, there is a tension between initiatives. A former colleague of mine, Kevin Dahan, has been working in the Stanford Karma Archive to make sure that those pieces can be reproduced, and where performance is involved, that there are new technologies that can simulate the old technologies so that we can keep them in repertoire. I think that's very laudable. Also, Simon Emerson has written a lot about ensuring the sustainability of old compositions performance. As I mentioned in my talk for education, the TASEM project from Michael Clark and his colleagues enables students to get into older pieces and go through the various phases of production and relive them, which I consider to be invaluable. I think the biggest problem is we have so much material over all these years, and yes, it may have started in 48. It's still a lot of years. And as the French music critic Maurice Fleuret once wrote about a lot of contemporary music, that many premières were also dernières, which was last performance. So he called it the Kleenex epic. You use once and you throw away. So the infatuation of the repertoire is maybe a debatable subject. I'm not saying that we should ignore history. I embrace it. But we also have to look forward. And a lot of that stuff are not dealing with the questions that we need to answer today. So what I liked about Francesco's talk is that he didn't end up with a summary. He ended up with questions. And I think that's where we are in the education, trying to figure out the best paths to optimize the experience of education, given the plurality of music today, the hugely diverse backgrounds and interests of our students, and that this is a reflection of our cultural horizon that we live in today.
May I?
Yeah, sure.
Hello,
sure.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
I'm Filippa. Yes, I'd like to ask something to Francesco about all courses offered in Italy. But the problem is the same, yes. It has been said by Landi, the idea, Professor Landi, the idea of this holistic perspective. It does not exist, as you mentioned. All teachers are different, their approaches. So this is dealing with the kind of repertoire too, of course. So the history is still must be written, let's say, right? That's a question for all, everyone also that wants to reply. Thank you.
I can give a contribution to the answer for Filippa. Ciao, Filippa. In all my work, I have two basic backgrounds. In my opinion, there are two basic backgrounds: the classical music and this avant-garde over the second world, of the 50s and 60s. These are two aspects to be known, very important. Then there are many, many different paths that teacher can follow, but these are, for me, are two backgrounds that are very, very important to study every musical discipline today. But the pluralism of electronic music teaching is a richness, in my opinion. In Italy, there is also an idea of some of my colleagues that we have to regulate the teaching of electronic music. So in every conservatory of music, things could be the same. This is not my opinion, because pluralism is a richness. So someone can go to study in a place or another and to see things completely in a different way. People have students have a possibility to make a choice and to go there, on there, to study different things. This is my approach.
Filippa, just a brief word to say that we've been teaching this holistic approach since the 90s. And in fact, I have a wonderful souvenir, and I cannot remember, Francesco, were you involved with that? Musica 2000 sent people from primarily from Rome and Milan to the college where I was the head of music at the time, because we had the project approach and we had thematic blocks that had popular music students and contemporary music students mixed in intensive programs. And they stayed for 3 days. There were about 40 people that came from Italy. I couldn't believe the money the government invested in this visit to demonstrate the alternative approach to music education. I know that this has been slightly affected the teaching, as you clearly demonstrated on how Italian music education has evolved, but it has been done, and we're not the only people doing it. My goal was to offer the suggestion to reinvestigate curricula to make them more holistic. But that's also based on what we as educators have to offer and what our students actually deserve to learn.
May I just add up just a few questions on probably on the last one. One thing that electronic music, I think, opens up as a problem is music aesthetics. I mean, electronic music poses to the common history of music a lot of questions, raises a lot of questions about its aesthetics. So how things are done from all the perspectives of aesthetics. It really makes changes the view of how things are done. So on the poetic process and how things are listened also. I think, I mean, electronic music really changes the way, challenges the way music aesthetics has been thought in a traditional way, because and we saw it from different perspectives from all your interventions. So what I'm asking is, in the music technology courses, do you reflect on aesthetical principles? So, for example, on how does technology interacts with the human perspective, and so it changes the way writing has been done. So how does it interact in the writing process, if it does? Or I mean, many possible aesthetic fundamental questions. Because maybe this is in somehow also an intersectional, are intersectional questions. I mean, which are not just bound to a genre or to a specific repertoire, but they can be dealt with from different from different repertoires of different musics of electronic music.
Could I maybe suggest something which I think is interesting, because again, my tendency is to think in terms of the narrative history, because in some fundamental respects, my point of view, at least in the way that I'm defining it here, is that of a historical musicologist who wants to understand how we tell a story that incorporates the sound-based into the note-based paradigms, to use Lee Landy's terms. And it seems to me that people haven't figured that out. that both from a theoretical and from a historiographical point of view, those two paradigms are not communicating. And perhaps even at a collegial level, we're not communicating. So this is the challenge. And the question of technology to me is fascinating, because it seems that the note-based paradigm is very comfortable with aesthetics. If we think about the way we teach Romanticism, for example, we're very comfortable with branching out into the other art forms and thinking in fundamentally interdisciplinary terms. And our notion of the aesthetic seems pretty well developed. But as I'm trying to suggest, I think that our most prominent general narrative historians don't know how to talk about the aesthetic component of the origins of sound-based music. And that I think is a vast methodological problem for how we introduce this tradition to our students in music history programs. But now there's a but here. I also think that the note-based paradigm has a very difficult time talking about technology. To suggest that electronic music raises questions of technology is to presuppose that the technological only occurs as an issue in 1948 or in 1913 with Intonaro Mori, whereas of course the entire tradition of Western music is technological. So the converse is that there's a blindness, I think, to the technological prior to the advent of sound-based music, right? Whereas the technological somehow takes over as the dominant narrative force at 1948 or in 1952. So we're at cross purposes in both ways, these two paradigms.
Absolutely. This was a very, very good point. Francesco wants to have seen or no? Okay.
Giacomo,
go on.
Our courses are plenty of aesthetics matters, okay? The problem is, for example, that I feel completely inappropriate to discuss this kind of aspect. I'm not an expert on this, but students and the things of music continuously pose the problem of aesthetics. So it would be nice to have a strong educational part about philosophy of music, for example. It would be very, very helpful.
Yes, and probably philosophy of music should treat more, as Blake said, also more about electronic music, because it raises a lot of questions of what it was, so what it has been before it, and so what we usually think of music aesthetics. So it really does challenge the whole field of music understanding. So I see that it is already 5:15. We promised to finish at 5. So if there is no question, I have so many questions to pose, but I think it is quite late for. I mean, it's already. If someone of the audience has some, as questions, then Valentina, if you do agree, I would greet all the panelists and thank them very, very much, Francesco and Blake and Lee and Kate. Different perspectives, different ways of understanding, different in somehow fields like media studies, like electronic music, all that deal with aspects of aesthetics, also of changing the way we feel music and the electronic music too. So I do thank you all the panelists and all the audience also for the warm participation and see you next time. Thank you very, very much.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Giacomo.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Valentina.